Never forget that more than half the scientists working on the Manhattan Project seriously believed that once you started an atomic reaction, a fission reaction, that you would not be able to stop it. It would ignite the atmosphere and incinerate the world. And they set it off anyway. Glad we were wrong about that. I tell you that because as we speak in some government lab somewhere, probably deep underground, they are tampering with the basic building blocks of the universe. That's a scary thought. So they tested it. It worked. The very same day that they tested it in the morning and found out it worked, later that day, the USS Indianapolis departs from San Francisco carrying bomb components to Tinian. July the 26th, the Indianapolis arrives at Tinian, and just 10 days later, the Enola Gay takes off and bombs Hiroshima with the world's first atomic bomb, a uranium bomb, whereas the bomb they tested at the Trinity site was a plutonium bomb. Why would they drop a uranium bomb that they had not tested? It's because the Nazis had already tested it. They knew it worked. They swapped us, the atomic bombs, for immunity. But it gets worse, because the atomic bombs, that was nothing. They were into other stuff. They had their V-2 rockets. They had all this stuff, and it was all taken out of the hands and out of the control of the German Wehrmacht and of the German power structure. Okay, it was all turned over to the SS. The SS created within Nazi Germany their own little empire, and they were in charge of everything. And SS General Hans Kammler is the guy who ended up in command of all of their exotic weaponry. He told Werner von Braun openly that he was going to turn over the V-2s and the V-2 scientists to the Americans in exchange for immunity. And yet, as we all know, that didn't happen. He disappeared after telling von Braun, I'm going to disappear, and he did, although there are rumors he was seen in the United States after the war. And we know that the Patton's army going through Bavaria and on into Czechoslovakia picked up the V-2 rockets and the rocket scientists, including von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and the rest. So what did Kammler have that was even more enticing to the Allies than V-2 rockets? Well, he had flying saucers, for one thing. And these saucers, some of them did not fly using jet propulsion. There was a secret Nazi research facility in Poland near the German border. Here you can see what's left of it today. And I would point out this very strange structure right here. Was that, at first they thought maybe it was a test for helicopters or something, but that didn't work out. And then they found all this extensive cabling going into it, insulated wiring. Was that a superconductor? And this gets into some strange stuff. In the drawing up here, you'll see what witnesses described as what they were working on. They called it Die Glocke, the bell. And it was rotating vortex energy. They were creating energy fields. And any of you that have looked into UFOs, you know that that's the UFO propulsion, rotating energy fields. The picture is a duplicate bell, a rotating energy plasma generator that they're working on at Warsaw's Institute of Plasma Research and Laser Microfusion. So they found out there are a lot of attributes to this, including the possibility of creating wormholes in time and space. Time-traveling Nazis. How do you like that? Sounds like a bad sci-fi movie, but folks, it was real. Now this leads us into the white powder of gold. Does everybody know about the white powder of gold? Yeah, a little bit, maybe not. Under certain circumstances, when you get monatomic matter, that's single atom elements, heavy elements of gold and silver, and when under certain circumstances, when you spin them, the nuclei begin to come apart and change and alter and mutate, and it changes composition. This has been studied at several universities, and a guy by the name of David Hudson in 1988 actually obtained 11 patents on what he called ORME, orbitally rearranged monatomic elements. Interestingly enough, ORME is ancient Hebrew for the tree of life. Oh, thank you. Actually, I got one here. I just wasn't using it. You can find all this in gold, silver, copper, platinum, all these heavy metals, all of which are conductors for energy. Now, to show you this isn't just some wild rambling, here's just a few of the scientific papers that have been published talking about the atomic structure and the ability to change the formation and to modify the nuclei of atoms. We're talking about, this is what I was talking about, this is the basic building blocks of the universe, energy. And if you can alter energy at the atomic and subatomic level, then you can just about do anything. Now, let's quickly take a look through history to find out, is this really stuff that we're just now finding out? No. This is something that's known throughout history. We know that the alchemists were all trying to change base metals into gold. They knew somehow, probably from ancient writings, that you could mutate the atomic structure and you could create gold. In fact, Irenaeus Philalethes, whoever, a 17th century alchemist, wrote our stone, the Philosopher's Stone, the elixir of life, which, by the way, some people have equated to the Holy Grail, is the Philosopher's Stone. Some people have speculated the Philosopher's Stone is a meteorite or some object from space. But he wrote, our stone is nothing but gold adjusted to the highest degree of purity and subtle fixation of very fine powder. Now let's go back further in history. And we find the ancient Egyptians had what they call the shamanan, the mafuz, the manna, the white powder gold, the conical bread. Okay, and it was said that this was given to the pharaohs on their journey to the afterlife, and that at each step along the way to the afterlife, they would stop and say, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. It had been handed down to them from ancient gods. We can find it mentioned in the Bible, but not by that name. As the Israelites came out of Egypt, led by Moses, who we are told was steeped in Egyptian lore and knowledge and knew about this stuff, they wandered in the wilderness, and how were they sustained? They'd wake up in the morning and there was a fine white powdery substance lying on the ground. And they would ask, what is it? And in Hebrew, what is it? The word is manna. This was the manna from heaven. And they would mold it into little cakes. They'd heat it up. They'd eat it. And that's how they sustained themselves. Because what they had found with monatomic gold is it not only has healing properties, it actually cleans up your DNA. Now, it's also said that the Ark of the Covenant contained white powder. This is where they carried the white powder. And this white powder obviously had a power of its own. And it's been honored down through the centuries. In this painting of a Knights Templar meeting, we see the Ark is venerated. And in the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, we find the Masons still revere the Ark of the Covenant. So let's take just a half minute and look at the Ark of the Covenant. We know from the Bible description, the dimensions, we know the lid of the mercy seat was 3.5 inches thick and made of pure gold. And folks, that'd weigh 2,714 pounds. How does 4 people pick up more than a ton and carry it around? Well, they don't. What we now know, because it was filled with white powder, and they have found with this white powder of gold, when you put it on a weighing pan and heat it, that it weighs less than it did before you even put it in the pan. The pan weighs less too. So it not only has anti-gravity properties, but it can transmit those properties to whatever it's sitting in. In the late 1980s at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, they cooled a ceramic superconductor by liquid nitrogen to produce a magnetic cushion and floated this round magnet. So we've already duplicated this effect in the laboratories. So they weren't carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they were just guiding it along. And with this superconducting and this extremely atomic, subatomic material, they were able to communicate. Remember, they heard sounds coming from the seat. They were able to maybe even, if you'll remember the story of Nebuchadnezzar and Meshach, Abednego, and he built the gold place, and they went in and they said, are they in there? And they said, well, the three Hebrew priests are in there, but there's also a fourth person in there. Well, where did he come from? And they said, and Nebuchadnezzar says, who is that? He said, well, it's the Son of God. Oops, did they create a wormhole? Did they create some kind of portal, dimensional time portal? And of course, then we have the famous story of Moses coming down from the mountains, and the people of Israel knew that gold was somehow magical, but they didn't know how it worked because only the priests, only the knowledgeable ones knew the real secrets. And he got angry, and he took the calf which they had made, burned it with fire, ground it to a powder, and made them drink it. Well, now, wait a minute. We can't be talking about molten gold, because if you try to make somebody drink molten gold, you're going to kill them. No, he was reducing it to the powder and giving it to them to improve their DNA and maybe sharpen up their brains a little bit so they would begin to understand what was going on. Mount Horeb in the southern Sinai is also known as the Mount of Moses. And in 1904, the British archaeologist Sir William Petrie discovered what he called an ancient Egyptian temple on Mount Horeb. And nearby, they found ancient gold mining operations. And Petrie and his people, when they were exploring there, they lifted up the flagstones, and what do they find but white powder, a white powder. They didn't know what it was, so they left it open, and it all blew away. Was this the powder? Of course it was. And the wealth of the Israelites gathered in Egypt, along with their knowledge of such things, finally was put to rest in Jerusalem in Solomon's temple. And researchers have said that Solomon's temple was a carbon copy of a Sumerian temple dedicated to their god Ninurta and constructed almost 1,000 years previously. How many of y'all have read Sitchin? You know about the Anunnaki and you know about... there you go. This information came from Samaria down into Egypt thanks to the patriarch Abraham, and that gave rise to the Egyptian civilization, which, if you know about Egyptology, just seemed to spring from nowhere, full-blown, and then instead of evolving upward, it devolved. So the earliest of the Egyptian stuff was the best. In the back of the Solomon's temple was the little area where they kept the ark, and that was the worship area. And the front was like this huge barn-like thing. Well, what was that for? That was to hold the treasure, because when they came out of Egypt, Moses told them, take everything you need, meaning clothing and food, but they took that to mean take anything that wasn't nailed down. And they took gold and silver, they took a lot of riches, and then for 40 years they went through the wilderness, conquering one city-state after another. And as was the custom of the day, when you whipped somebody, you took their wife, their children, you took all their goods, you took their gold and silver. And so, after a while they got tired of schlepping that through the desert, and they finally stored it in Solomon's temple. And the Solomon's treasure was the legendary and the greatest treasure in the history of the world. Man, I'm running out of time. I'm barely there. I better get moving. So what happened to it? The Romans attacked Jerusalem. They got a portion of it. They took it back to Rome. 400 years later, Alaric the Goth sacked Rome, and they carried it back to their home grounds in the Languedoc region of southern France. That gave rise to the Cathars and then to the French aristocrats, including St. Bernard, who fomented the First Crusade. to bring freedom and democracy to the Middle East. No, not really. No, they were going after the rest of the treasure. So they went and they excavated under the Temple of Solomon for 9 years, and they got the rest of the treasure that had been hidden there, and they brought it back to southern France. So all of a sudden, Solomon's treasure was reunited in southern France. That, of course, brings us to the mystery of Rennes-le-Château, which I won't go into, but it all had to do with this fabulous treasure, which even Father Saunier probably did not discover, but he did discover some of the genealogies and at least got on the track of the great treasure. But what happened to the treasure? Hitler's top commando was Otto Skorzeny. Here he is when he rescued Mussolini off the mountaintop. And by the way, this gave Hitler the excuse. Italy changed sides and decided they were going to join the Allies. So they had imprisoned Mussolini. Otto Skorzeny goes in, rescues him, takes him back to Hitler. Hitler declares Mussolini still the legitimate ruler of Italy, and the war went on in Italy. And right up to the end of the war, we were fighting in Italy, but we weren't fighting the Italians, we were fighting the Germans. March 1944, because of all that, Hitler said, I have to protect the vulnerable underbelly of Europe. So at that point, northern France had been occupied. Southern France had been Vichy France, and it was they put on the show like it was an autonomous region. But at that point, in September 43, Hitler says, no, I got to protect all of Europe. So they sent the troops and occupied all of France, all the way down into southern France, into the Languedoc region. And in March of 44, SS troops led by Skorzeny entered the Languedoc and then set up camp near the Cathar fortress of Monsignor. And on March the 16th, Skorzeny sends Berlin a telegram simply stating, Eureka! I found it. And he signed it with his code name, Narba, which means scar. He had a big scar across his face. The Nazis got Solomon's treasure. Not only the wealth, but the knowledge. The treasure was backpacked out of the mountains of the foothills of the Pyrenees, loaded onto seal railroad cars, taken to Berchtesgaden, where they were initially hidden in the warrens under there, and then the gold was melted down, the silver was melted down, the gems were spread out. When Morton Bormann, Hitler's deputy who took over after Hess, when his wife was arrested in Austria at the end of the war, she had all these ancient gold coins on her. Where did that come from? Roman coins came from the treasure of Solomon. Here is just a portion of the gold that the Allies discovered at Merkers, Germany in 1945. This is what they got. Imagine what got away. And this is because of Action Adlerflut or Action Operation Eagle Flight. Eagle Flight out of Germany. Morton Bormann, Schmitz, the head of IG Farben, who, by the way, held as much stock in Standard Oil as the Rockefellers, along with these corporations, were moved everything worth anything out of Germany through the rat lines that were augmented significantly by the Vatican. Many of them used Vatican papers to obtain visas from the Red Cross, and they moved them out of there. And a lot of people knew what was going on. Why was this allowed? Because at the end of the war, who became High Commissioner of Germany? John J. McCloy, former head of Chase Bank, the very bank that had funded Hitler. And Allen Dulles, who'd been operating out of Italy, then moved in, became OSS chief in Berlin, and began whitewashing the backgrounds of these Nazis. Why? Because they had made arrangements for the atomic bomb. We know that the church went right along with the Nazis. Okay, and so they were all for it. And by the way, anybody stop to think that the current Pope was a Hitler Youth? So they're still in charge? Governor of California, his father was a Nazi Gauleiter, wore a little Hitler mustache. And Schwarzenegger early on was a big admirer of Hitler, said all kinds of good things about him, and until he got to be governor of California, and then they started talking about running for president. Hide and watch. They'll run him for president.